No one knows for sure when history began to distort itself, but some ancient records, scattered among forgotten temples and nearly illegible scrolls, point to a disturbing fact. Humanity's greatest technological leap forward wasn't achieved. It was delivered. Not by inventors, not by brilliant civilizations, but by beings who descended from the heavens with a purpose that remains shrouded in shadow to this day. What if the constructions we now call impossible, temples that defy gravity, blocks of stone that fit together with millimeter precision, were merely vestiges of a present that also carried a curse? To understand this story, we must go back thousands of years to a time when humans still feared the sky and revered the unknown. People scattered across deserts, forests, and valleys had no contact with one another, and yet they told similar stories. Stories of lights that appeared in the darkest nights, of figures clothed in radiance, who walked among mortals and whispered words no human language could translate. Among these peoples, there were leaders who stood out not only for their strength, but also for their ambition. Kings who ruled with an iron fist, but also with a constant gaze fixed on the horizon, as if they knew something, or someone, was about to arrive. These men were not ordinary. Chosen by ancient lineages, they believed their power came from the gods, and perhaps in a way it did. But these gods were not as the priests described. When they appeared, there was no thunder or lightning. There was a heavy silence, and a presence that made the air vibrate. The chronicles describe wings, but not feathers. Wings that seemed made of solid light, moving as if they breathed. Their eyes were not human, and when they looked into them, the kings felt a weight, as if they were standing before something that knew their every thought. It was in this setting that the first contact occurred. Not a chance encounter, but a calculated approach. The angels, if that name describes them correctly, chose their interlocutors carefully, and they sought not the humble or the righteous, but those who could shape the destinies of thousands. And so, a pact began to take shape. A silent agreement, whose words were never written, but whose effects would echo for millennia. The kings would offer something not everyone would understand: loyalty, worship, and perhaps the very future of humanity. In return, they would receive a gift that would forever alter the course of civilization, knowledge and technology beyond the reach of any human on Earth. But what exactly was delivered? And what was the true price hidden behind this gift? It was not in broad daylight that the meeting took place. The chronicles tell of a night when the moon seemed wounded, tinged with red, while an unusual silence covered the entire kingdom. No animal dared move, no fire crackled. The wind died, and even the priests sensed that this was a time not for men. It was then that, in the distance, a light appeared on the horizon. It wasn't like the fire they knew, nor the brightness of the stars. It was something pulsating, alive, growing brighter by the second. The guards, overcome with fear, retreated. But the king, drawn by a force he couldn't explain, took firm steps toward the glow. When the light faded, they were there. They didn't walk. They glided across the ground as if the world were shaped to receive them. Their figures were tall, imposing, and the air around them trembled, distorting the vision like an invisible heat. There was no sound of wings, but something in the surrounding shadows suggested those forms might open up and envelop the entire sky. The first to speak wasn't the king. It was one of them. The voice didn't seem to come from outside, but echoed within his mind, like a thought that wasn't his own. "Son of men, your throne is destined to fall unless you accept what we have to offer." The king didn't respond immediately. Fear mingled with ambition, and he knew he was facing something that could change not only his reign, but all of history. What followed was no ordinary dialogue. It was a pact. There was no ink, no parchment, just whispered promises under a sky that seemed to bear witness to the impossible. The agreement had 3 pillars. 1. Absolute loyalty. The king should obey the commands he would receive, even if he did not understand them. 2. Protection of secrecy. No common man should know where that power came from. 3. Preparing for the future. The works built with the new technology would not just be monuments. They would be landmarks, aligned with the heavens, to guide something that was yet to come. In return, They would hand over tools that could shape stone as if it were clay, metals that could not rust, maps that described the sky in detail that humanity would only discover millennia later. But there was one detail the king didn't notice, or chose to ignore. Each gift bore an invisible mark, a sign that it didn't belong to Earth. And like every gift, there was a price that wouldn't be exacted from him, but from all his descendants. From that night on, the walls began to grow faster, the cities rising with impossible perfection. But along with this progress, rumors arose, voices that said the king no longer ruled alone, that someone, or something, was sitting beside him on the throne. The gifts arrived in ways no chronicler has been able to explain. They were not brought by carts or carried by men. They appeared silently in the palace's inner halls, as if the air itself had woven them. The first was a thin blade, so sharp it could split a block of granite in half effortlessly. Its metal was unlike anything else. It didn't rust, break, or dull. Some said it wasn't forged by fire, but shaped by light. The second gift was even more incomprehensible. Cylinders with smooth surfaces, engraved with symbols no scribe could decipher. When rotated in a specific way, they emitted a low, constant sound, and any stone they were placed on moved as if floating. The third gift was not a tool, but a map, a black parchment, where the stars shone as if alive. It was more than a simple record of the sky. It showed alignments that had not yet occurred, future dates when certain points of light would intersect in the firmament. And beside the map, a single instruction: build according to the stars. The effects were immediate. Within months, monuments began to appear on sites that had previously been mere hills or empty plains. Colossal blocks fitted together with precision that today we call millimeter, but which, at the time, seemed like magic. The walls were unbroken, and the temples stood straight, as if molded from a single piece. The people marveled. The king was celebrated as the chosen one of the gods, and his fame spread to distant kingdoms. But while his subjects danced in the squares, there were those who saw another side to the story. The priests began to notice strange changes in the monarch's behavior. His eyes, once restless, became cold and calculating. His decisions were swift, but ruthless. It was as if an invisible thought, coming from elsewhere, guided every word he spoke. And it wasn't just the king who changed. Some nights, tall, hooded figures were seen walking among the construction sites, observing every detail. Workers swore that by dawn, entire stones had been moved without anyone having touched them. Still, no one dared question it. Progress was too rapid, and those who received benefits didn't want to hear about curses. But in shadowy corners of the kingdom, mothers told their children to stay away from the new buildings, saying that at night, the walls seemed to whisper. The Pact was working. The works grew, the king's glory increased, and ancient technology shaped the nation's destiny. But along with the greatness, something silent and invisible spread, like a shadow lengthening as the sun begins to set. As the years passed, the king's works began to attract attention from distant kingdoms. Travelers described walls so smooth that even water ran off them without leaving a mark. Columns built with stones so large that even 10 men together could not move them. But the most intriguing thing wasn't the buildings themselves. It was what they hid. Temples and palaces were designed with perfect alignments with the stars, not just the solstice or equinox, as some people did, but with very rare celestial events that would only occur once every thousands of years. And somehow these alignments were not unique to that realm. Explorers returned with reports of temples in distant jungles, pyramids in deserts, and fortresses on faraway islands that all shared the same pattern. Cultures that had never officially come into contact, but who built as if following the same map. The question began to grow. Who was really planning these works? Was it the king, or those who had given him the gifts? Over time, darker signs began to appear. Hunters reported lights hovering over construction sites at night. Men returned from construction with blank stares, as if they couldn't remember what they'd done during the day. Some disappeared completely, their names scratched from official lists as if they'd never existed. The older priests began to murmur that the Pact had changed, that at first, the gifts were a blessing. But now the price was beginning to be exacted. The climax of this story occurred one night when the sky split open with light. Not a flash of lightning, but a brilliant crack that seemed to cut through the firmament. From it descended the same figures that had appeared years before. But this time, they weren't alone. Behind them, shadows moved in indescribable shapes. Wings that weren't wings, faces that shifted expressions like smoke in the wind. The air grew heavy, and even the most loyal guards fell to their knees, not out of respect, but out of fear. The king was led to the center of the main courtyard, before the starry map engraved in stone. One of them spoke, and though no sound came out, everyone heard it in their minds. The time has come. What you built was not for your kingdom, but for us. In that instant, understanding fell upon him like an unbearable weight. Every temple, every wall, every standing stone was not a monument of glory, but a beacon, a call. And on the horizon, the stars began to change position, as if answering the call. That night, the king realized he had never been in control. From their first meeting, every decision, every order, every stone placed in its right place, it was all part of a much larger plan, drawn up long before he was born. The figures of light and shadow remained in the courtyard, observing the buildings like a sculptor observing his finished work. None of those present dared to speak. Some tried to look away, but it was impossible. There was something in that glow that held attention like invisible chains. The celestial map that had been delivered years before now illuminated itself, each point of light pulsating in sync with real stars in the sky. The buildings of the kingdom, seen from above, formed symbols that no human recognized, but which seemed perfectly understandable to those who had come to seek them. The king didn't know whether to feel pride or terror. He had granted prosperity to his people, but he had also opened the door to something not of earth. The promise of protection and glory hid another truth. His kingdom was merely a piece on a board that extended to worlds he could never have imagined. And then, one of the visitors approached. He didn't walk. He glided until he stood before him. The voice echoed in his mind. "The pact has been fulfilled, but your lineage still belongs to us." A chill ran down his spine. He knew he wouldn't live forever, but the promise made that first night had no expiration date. And as subtly as they had arrived, the figures moved away, returning to the torn light in the sky, which closed in the blink of an eye, leaving only silence and a chilling wind that swept through the courtyard. In the days that followed, nothing seemed to have changed. The works remained, the subjects continued with their lives, and the king maintained his throne. But at night, he felt a presence in his room, as if he were being watched. In his dreams, he saw the stars moving and heard those words again, "Build according to the stars." Centuries later, explorers would find those same structures. Some would say they were temples, others fortresses, but none of them could explain how stones weighing hundreds of tons were moved, cut, and fitted together with impossible precision. And the strangest thing was that, in distant places, other structures, built by people who had never met, followed the same alignment, as if they had all received the same map. Perhaps the king wasn't the only one. Perhaps the pact was repeated countless times, with different names, different thrones, but with the same promise and the same price. What if these angels are still watching? What if the next alignment of the stars is already near? Maybe we're already building something for them. The years passed, but the silence of the buildings was never absolute. At night, guards swore they heard a low, murmuring sound coming from the walls. Some said it was the wind. Others, more superstitious, believed it was voices, messages carved into the very stones by the Pact's unseen architects. One early morning, a young apprentice scribe, tasked with recording the measurements of the walls, decided to press his ear to the smooth surface of one of the blocks. The cold stone made his skin crawl. He expected to hear only the echo of his own blood rushing in his ears. But what came was different. A deep, distant voice repeated words in a language he didn't understand. Each night, he returned to the same spot, noting sounds and intonations. Gradually, he began to recognize patterns. It wasn't human language, but it seemed to have a rhythm, like a chant or instruction. The more he listened, the stranger his dreams became. Visions of non-existent cities, skies cut by columns of light, and creatures whose faces never remained the same for more than an instant. When the king heard this, he showed no surprise. On the contrary, he ordered the young man brought to the palace. In the royal hall, the apprentice repeated the sound he had heard, trying to imitate the intonation. Then something changed. The torches flickered, the air grew heavy, and the ground seemed to vibrate beneath his feet. The king, with a fixed and expressionless look, simply said, "They started talking again." After that, orders were given in secret. Workers were sent to reinforce certain sections of the wall, not for repair, but to open hidden passages. What lay behind the stones was not on the kingdom's official map. Narrow tunnels led to windowless chambers where symbols glowed faintly, as if the stone held light within. These chambers were not made for humans. The ceilings were too high, and the doors wide enough for something much larger to pass through. In the center of each room stood a smooth, unmarked pedestal, but it emitted a strange warmth, even in the early morning chill. The young scribe was never seen again outside these chambers. Some said he had been appointed keeper of secrets, others that he had become lost within the tunnels, following voices that called his name. The whispers of the stones did not cease. On the contrary, they seemed to grow louder as certain celestial alignments approached. The king, now aged, spent hours alone in the underground corridors, as if awaiting a visitor. And on specific nights, when the stars aligned identically to the ancient map, the walls emanated an almost imperceptible glow, as if answering a silent call from far beyond the sky. Winter came early that year. The wind sweeping down from the mountains brought not only cold but a strange electricity to the air, as if invisible storms were swirling over the kingdom. The nights were quieter, and even the dogs, who had previously barked at every movement, remained huddled together, staring at the sky. It was on one of these nights that the first sign appeared. A point of light, motionless, floated above the citadel. It wasn't a star. It was much larger and pulsed with a hypnotic rhythm. For hours, it remained there, until suddenly it began to move, tracing in the air the same figure engraved on the ancient map kept by the king. The next day, strange changes occurred. Wells began to dry up, while springs of water appeared in places where streams had never been. Entire fields of wheat ripened overnight, but the harvested grain had a strange, almost metallic sheen, and when ground, it produced a gray flour that gave off a sickly sweet smell. The people were divided. Some believed they were blessings from the gods. Others saw them as an omen of misfortune. But the king knew. He recognized the signs. Each one was a preparation, an adjustment on the board, like a player positioning his pieces before the final blow. On the third night, the lights multiplied in the sky, no longer just one point, but dozens, forming patterns that seemed to dance. The air became so thick that breathing was an effort. And then, like the first time, they came. There was no bang, no flash, just a sudden presence. Tall figures, shrouded in an almost liquid glow, appeared on the walls, walking with the ease of someone who knows every stone, every tunnel, every secret. The shadows that accompanied them crept across the ground as if they had a life of their own, undulating against the walls. This time, they didn't look for the king. They walked the streets, peering into houses, knocking on doors, staring at children who couldn't look away. And with each tap, the walls trembled slightly, as if something were registering within them. When they finally reached the palace, the king was kneeling at the entrance, his head bowed, waiting. One of them approached, and without moving his lips, spoke to his mind. The harvest is ready. There was no longer any doubt. The buildings were not temples. They were markers. The people were not subjects. They were part of an inventory. At dawn, they were gone, leaving behind a silent realm and a suffocating sense that nothing, absolutely nothing, was under human control. And on the horizon, the stars still moved, but now, as if they were drawing closer. The first signs appeared discreetly, almost imperceptibly. Children who had previously spent hours playing in the streets now sat, staring blankly into the distance, as if waiting for something. Strong men began to feel a strange weakness in their legs, while elderly people, once bent over by the weight of years, walked with a nimbleness that no longer belonged to them. The changes weren't limited to the body. The nights became restless. The same dream began to be described by people of different ages and regions of the kingdom. A vast field, illuminated by a bluish light, where tall figures waited in silence. In the dream, no one felt fear, but upon waking, a deep chill ran down their spine. Doctors and healers couldn't explain what they saw. Wounds healed too quickly in some, while in others, simple cuts turned into dark spots that spread beneath the skin like roots. Metallic wheat, distributed free of charge, had become the staple food, and those who ate it frequently seemed to change more quickly. Soon the whispers began. It wasn't food, it was preparation. In the market, people spoke softly, looking over their shoulders, fearing the walls might hear. And perhaps they did. Workers in the underground chambers claimed the walls vibrated slightly whenever many spoke of the visitors. It was as if the stones were listening. The king rarely appeared in public. When he did, he seemed taller, more rigid, and his gaze no longer human. The few who still dared criticize him disappeared without a trace. Families were instructed not to speak of it, and strangely, within a few days, they seemed to forget that person had ever existed. Then came an event that marked the beginning of something greater. One moonless dawn, everyone in the kingdom awoke simultaneously. There was no noise, no warning, just the same irresistible urge to open their eyes. Looking up at the sky, they saw the lights, not just over the citadel, but across the entire horizon, forming a perfect circle. And then, a sound. Deep, continuous, vibrating in the bones, as if coming from within the body itself. It wasn't heard by the ears, but felt throughout. At that moment, everyone, men, women, and children, instinctively turned toward the star-aligned buildings. The stones, cold until then, began to emit a gentle heat, and along with the heat came a feeling of obedience, of acceptance, as if all self-will had been replaced by an invisible command. The people didn't know it, but they were already being shaped, not to serve the king, not to serve each other, but to serve those who would soon come to claim what was rightfully theirs. The first batch disappeared without warning. They were peasants, artisans, and common guards. No one heard screams or saw any fighting. In the morning, the houses were open, the beds still warm, but there was no sign of their occupants. The doors had not been forced open, and the valuables remained untouched. Only the people disappeared. The king made no pronouncement. Instead, groups of soldiers, with blank expressions and mechanical movements, began collecting lists of names in each neighborhood. Families were instructed to stay home for safety, but everyone knew that once a name was marked, the person would never return. The buildings began to behave strangely. At night, their surfaces glowed from within, revealing lines and symbols that weren't there during the day. The pedestals in the underground chambers, once silent, now emitted a constant pulse, like the heart of something alive. It was then that their true purpose was understood. They were not temples or fortresses. They were ports for something that came from outside. On a windless dawn, the deep rumbling that had awakened the kingdom weeks before returned, more intense, closer. The buildings began to vibrate, and the ground shook slightly, as if something colossal were approaching from beneath the earth. In the sky, the lights descended, one by one, until they rested directly over each point marked on the ancient map. And there, before the terrified eyes of the people, they opened, not like doors, but like vertical slits that cut through the air, revealing a space beyond, a starless void filled with a pulsating glow. From the crevices descended familiar figures, though not quite the same as before. They were larger, their contours more defined, as if less disguised. Along with them came faceless forms, but they moved as if they knew exactly where to go. Without resistance, without rushing, the chosen ones were guided to the passages. Some walked like sleepwalkers, others smiled as if they were going home. Those who tried to resist were simply tapped lightly on the shoulder and immediately continued on in silence. With each group that passed through the portal, a glow ran across the walls of the buildings and the pedestal pulsed faster. By the time the first night ended, hundreds had passed through. No one knew where they were going. Some believed they were being taken to a new world, others that they would become part of something much bigger, and others, more lucid, feared they were simply going, never to return. The king, watching everything from his throne, neither wept nor smiled. He simply kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if waiting for the moment when he himself would be summoned. And in the sky, beyond the lights, something gigantic began to reveal itself.